Okay, great. We're going to go ahead and get started. So good morning or good evening, everyone, from wherever in the world you're joining us from. Welcome to the Global Heat Health Information Network's 2020 Dialogues. I'm Joyce Shumate-Guillemot from the WHO-WMO Joint Office for Climate and Health in Geneva, Switzerland. And I'm here today with my co-coordinators of the network, Julie Tratron and Hunter Jones of NOAA, the United States Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. So thank you all so much for joining us today for the virtual dialogues. While these webinars cannot substitute for seeing everyone in person at our second biannual forum that was scheduled to take place this week in Copenhagen, we have done our best to transform our program into online masterclasses to substitute the live workshops that we were planning and the two dialogues today and tomorrow to explore the two major cross-cutting issues that emerged from our first forum in Hong Kong in 2018, where we formally launched this network. So the first topic, of course, is cities that we'll be focusing on, because over half of the world's population now lives in cities, and because they experience not only urban heat island effects, and are disproportionately warmer, but because they also have significant differences and inequalities in who is exposed to extreme heat. However, we also look to cities because they're a place full of opportunities and innovations. Innovations for protective social measures, for urban design and cooling. And today we're going to hear about some actions that can help us adapt to the increasingly hot world that we live in, but also show us how to start to increase the use of low carbon and energy efficient technologies that can also contribute to climate change mitigation. So tomorrow, the second issue that we'll be looking at are workers and how to protect workers from heat illness, but also lost incomes and job productivity. Because working populations of all ages in both cities and rural areas are highly exposed to hot conditions, particularly those working in construction, agricultural fields, open markets, factories. So looking forward to that conversation tomorrow. The GHIN Dialogues this week are not only about reviewing the state of the science, what we know in these domains, but they really aim to highlight the innovations as well as direct our attention to issues and gaps that need more investment. But most importantly, we hope these dialogues this week can help us start to talk about what we need to do and to help us more clearly see how we can work together. So again, I'd like to welcome everyone. We're really glad that each and every one of you is here to be part of this conversation. And because we at GHIN believe that each and every one of us is part of this solution in the diverse roles that we play in the many domains that we're all coming from. So I'm now going to pass to Julie, my co-collaborator, to quickly introduce the network and its vision. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the network is doing to give you some context for these dialogues before we jump into today's program. So over to you, Julie.
Thank you very much, Joy, and welcome everyone again from wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us. My job is to just tell you a little bit about the network itself and what we're doing, and hopefully inspire you, if you're not already engaged, to continue to engage with us. So the short version is that we know that the world is warming, and we know that the consequences are across timescales. And we also know that there are a lot of activities going on around the world, whether it's meteorological forecasts or actions being taken in cities, or we were not doing a very good job of weaving together a network to learn from each other, in this urgent situation where we know we're going to have more heat deaths, we know we're going to have more heat waves. People are working on issues, but we aren't really working together to learn from each other. We're not connecting well enough as we should to really move forward faster. We're trying to build capacity both to understand in the research mode, but also to apply that and make sure that the interventions are effective. The other piece is about just building awareness, the silent killer. It's not the one that people think of most when you think about disasters or real impacts, and yet it kills more people, as you know, than some of the other ones combined. So this network was really created to help us work together across timescales, across disciplines, learn from each other, share knowledge, build knowledge, and actually learn what's working, what's not working, and how do we actually work better together, faster to solve the problem sooner. And that's fundamentally the goal of the network. Joy will lay out for you a little bit of what we look like and how we work and some of our activities, and then some of the things on the horizon. But the network really relies on engagement from all of you to learn from each other in your various perspectives, whether you're a health practitioner, a meteorologist, or a social scientist, or an economist. You've got a role here, and we want to learn from you. So Joy, I think now it's up to you. I want to just thank Joy and the WMO WHO Joint Office for Climate and Health for taking the leadership on this. We in the United States very much want an international collaboration, so I'm really grateful for WMO for standing this up and to Joy for leading it. So back to you, Joy, and thanks again for all being here.
All right, thanks, Julie, for that great context. So I want to first start with who is GHIN? Who are we? Because we have a large number of supporting and contributing members from around the world. And we particularly have a very strong collaboration with public health agencies as well as national meteorological services like NOAA, because we're leveraging the policy and technical channels of both the World Meteorological Organization and the World Health Organization. We also have wide-ranging partners from academia, NGOs, other international organizations, and increasingly from the private sector. But most important to us is that our members are both coming from diverse interdisciplinary backgrounds and different sectors, but we're all coming to the table with very compatible motivations and shared principles that are focused on scientific integrity, using the best available knowledge for decision making about heat risks to human health, and that we're all focused at the end of the day on protecting public health. So featured here are some of our founding members that helped shape the network, but it certainly doesn't reflect everybody that we're collaborating with today. And in the coming months, you can expect to see more information coming up on our new website this fall about how to join the network and see the full scope of who is collaborating within the network. So what are we focused on delivering? Well, responding to the gaps that Julie presented, the mandate of the network was really solidified at our first forum and articulated in our call to action. And it established that the network really needed to come together to urgently improve awareness of this silent problem. That we really need to be building partnerships that foster this interdisciplinary co-learning so we can accelerate the conversation between research and practice, science and policy of what do we know, what do we not know, and what's working to address extreme heat risks. We also need to be synthesizing knowledge and information available for decision making and connecting up the expertise to improve access to the resources and knowledge, which we do have out there. There's amazing work that is happening in communities around the world, and we need to be connecting that up to learn from each other and accelerate what we're doing. And then finally, this network needs to be providing leadership, particularly the thought leadership that can help identify and promote the action to address these critical gaps. And that's going to range from better early warning systems to what interventions are most effective. So that's what we've been focused on as our aims. And in our first 18 months since we launched the network, we decided to focus in on a few key activities. And so we've been developing an online platform of new resources and country exposure profiles, developing some global synthesis products. We are committed to bringing the community together at biannual conferences. And because we can't get together in person, we're going to start a global teleconference online forum that I'll tell you about in a second. We've also been holding thematic trainings and workshops and standing up some technical working groups. And as the network is growing quite quickly and fast, we also see the direction in the future that we're going to be moving towards developing regional communities and expanding the partnerships we're involved with for joint programming and research activities. So just a snapshot of what we've been working on just this year, we had a South Asia Heat Health Summit in India, bringing together regional partners in South Asia to learn about major progress that's happened on the Indian subcontinent and how to support a sister network. We've had an innovation workshop, and I really want to highlight our Heat and COVID series in response to the coronavirus pandemic, because we anticipated the challenges that were going to be faced in managing heat waves during the pandemic. And we were able to very quickly bring together over 70 experts, many of you who may be on the line today, to produce some evidence reviews and guidance on 15 topics that would help communities, city authorities, public health agencies better manage heat waves during the pandemic. And this really showed the collective strength and the value of this network. And then finally, we brought our masterclass series online and offered 4 courses which are publicly available, and you can see the website for those materials and videos. I just want to mention a couple things to look forward to and how you can engage with us in the coming months. We're very excited to almost be ready to launch next month a brand new website. This is going to have a lot of new content and resources that's going to help all of us share and learn a lot more from each other. There's a new expert database, new inventories of heat action plans, case studies, and we hope this fall an action platform of evidence-based interventions. So of course we depend on you to share new content and information, so please do share your materials so we can help you gain visibility and others to learn from you. The final things to look forward to this fall is a monthly teleconference series that we will start in September to help us better coordinate across the network. And then we'll be having a new masterclass series on brand new topics. So please do subscribe to the digest to follow these announcements of what's coming. And then finally, we do hope to bring the community back together again and meet many of you in person for a 3rd forum sometime in 2021, depending on the state of the world. So again, please stay tuned for all of these upcoming events. That's the last of my promo for how to get involved in the network. So I want to get started on today's program. So please let me hand over to Professor Ladd Keith, who is an interdisciplinary urban planning and climate researcher from the University of Arizona, who's going to introduce and lead us in the main event of the day, Heat in the City. So over to you, Ladd.
Great, thank you so much, Joy and Julie, and welcome to everyone attending, and welcome to our first GHIN Dialogue of the summer, Heat in the City. Again, my name is Ladd Keith, and I'm an assistant professor in planning at the University of Arizona. And I'd like to thank Julie Riggi at the American Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center and Xiao Ren of the University of Hong Kong for their help organizing this dialogue that we'll start shortly in just a minute. Our goal with this dialogue is really to highlight the current state of practice and innovation for extreme cities. And my own personal research area is at the intersection of climate science and urban planning, including how cities plan and govern for extreme heat. And in the last few years, researchers like myself have seen practitioners advancing our understanding of how to map and model heat, how to mitigate heat through design and planning of the built environment, and how to prepare for and respond to extreme heat events, especially in the emergency management and public health sectors. Many of these advances, though, have occurred in silos, and our cities are still not as well prepared to meet these extreme heat risks as they need to be, particularly for marginalized and disenfranchised people and communities who are almost always the most vulnerable to climate risks, such as extreme heat. This summer alone, we've seen how extreme heat is compounding risk with other risks, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. But even after the pandemic, we'll still see additional compounding risks with extreme heat, which makes it so important to address in this urban context. So tackling these critical issues and shedding light on opportunities for cities to become more resilient to extreme heat was one of the goals of this dialogue. And we have a really fantastic panel who represent a diverse set of disciplines, sectors, and geographies to do just that. So just a brief overlay of the dialogue. I'll first introduce our moderator, who will then introduce our 4 panelists. Then you'll have an opportunity to do some interaction so we can get to know you via Mentimeter. The panelists will each share a short 10-minute presentation, and then we'll have a moderated discussion with the panelists. And you can contribute some questions and vote them up through Mentimeter as well. And just as a note, this webinar is being recorded, and the recording and additional resources will be available on the GHIN website afterwards. And with that, I'm happy to introduce our moderator, Lori Goring, who is the climate change editor and head of climate program at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. She has run climate change news coverage for a decade at the foundation, which is the charitable arm of the Reuters news agency. Her team's award-winning stories have focused on the human impacts of climate change, told from the front line in some of the world's most climate vulnerable locations and innovative countries. She has a particular interest in reporting heat risks and is the perfect person to moderate this discussion today. She was previously at the Chicago Tribune and has been a correspondent in all over the world in New Delhi, Johannesburg, Havana, Mexico City, Rio de Janeiro, and London. And she has written on climate change issues for nearly 2 decades from dozens of countries. And with that, I'll pass it over to Lori, so please take it from here.
Thanks, Lad. Yeah, we know increasing heat, particularly in cities, is one of the biggest and still least recognized risks around the world. I mean, both in places that are already known for heat problems and even for those that are not so far. And we know that cities are heat islands that trap and hold more heat than the surrounding rural areas. And we know that heat hits the most vulnerable hardest. That's the elderly, those with existing health risks, and particularly the poor without the money to pay for adequate cooling and water, or those who live far from green spaces. As Lad said, I worked in Chicago for years. It saw nearly 800 deaths in a heat wave in 1995. And I remember interviewing elderly people that lived in rough neighborhoods who were too scared to open their windows at night and during the day and ended up dying in the heat. I lived in New Delhi, where in the summertime it was 45 degrees, which is about 113 degrees during the day, and only dropped to 40 at night, which didn't feel like much relief. And I remember seeing people sleeping along the curbs in the city, along the roadway, to try to catch a breeze passing cars is the only real way to keep cool at that time. And I also worked in Basra in southern Iraq, and I remember interviewing someone in 50-degree heat there, which is about 122 degrees, with sweat just pouring off my back, even as I sat dead still in the shade. And I remember thinking how much that felt like a human rights violation to me, this kind of heat. And it's one of the reasons I continue to be worried about this. But in cities, that's where we see a lot of the innovation happening around reducing heat risk. From India's Ahmedabad, which in 2013 put in that pioneering heat action plan after all the deaths there, to cities like New York, which is doing a lot now with cool green spaces and painting surfaces white and so on. But it can be really hard work, particularly when the funding is limited, the city departments don't always have the same goals or coordination, politics gets in the way, and now we've got COVID-19 as well, which is making things challenging, not least because it's closing malls and other cool public spaces, or at least limiting the numbers in them. So to talk about all this today, we have 4 terrific panelists. The first is Regina Vetter. She's the network manager of the Cool Cities Network at C40. In this position, she's responsible for supporting global cities to manage urban heat island effects and to implement greening and cooling solutions. Regina also provides technical guidance on climate adaptation aspects of the city's climate action plans and facilitates the integration of urban adaptation and mitigation climate solutions. Next, we'll have Jeffrey Raven. He's an associate professor and director of the graduate program in urban and regional design at New York Institute of Technology in New York. He's also the principal of Raven Architecture and Urban Design and co-chair of the American Institute of Architects, the New York chapter, and the Planning and Urban Design Committee. He's a specialist in sustainable and resilient urban design. And he's really worked in a huge number of places around the world, from the Arabian Gulf, India, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, Africa, and the United States, on all kinds of issues, including low carbon communities, green buildings, and smart growth. Then we've got Dr. Calvin Lee Kwan. He's the General Manager of Corporate Development and Strategy at Link REIT. He's a passionate believer in using creativity and innovation to advance corporate sustainability in today's world of high urban density and smart city living. With a DNB from the UCLA and an MBA from the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern, he has a strong foundation in understanding the integrated nature of society, the environment, and the challenges of operating a business within their context. He's worked at Link REIT since 2012 as a General Manager, Corporate Development and Strategy. He's a committee member of the UN Environment Program Finance Institute's Investment Committee, co-chair and Asia Pacific representative of the Property Working Group, and is a member of the Benchmark Committee of the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. And finally, we have Kizzy Charles Guzman, who is Deputy Director of the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency. She leads efforts to strengthen neighborhoods, community organizations, and social infrastructure so they're ready to withstand and emerge stronger from the impacts of climate change. Kizzy engages in environmental justice priorities. She engages in citywide sustainability and resilience planning efforts to ensure that social, public health, and environmental justice priorities are integrated into adaptation plans and environmental policies. She led the development of Cool Neighborhoods New York City, the city's first comprehensive strategy to address the impacts of rising temperature and heat waves. Before we get started, we'd like to know a little bit about you, those of you who are listening in today. So we're going to go over to the Mentimeter. Ruth, are you going to introduce that?
Yes, just give me one moment to put it up on my screen. Excellent. So you should all see a slide from Mentimeter, and this is a way for you to interact with us and tell us a little bit about yourselves. So what I suggest everyone does is take a second on your phone or in a browser window to go to www.menti.com and use the code 974111 at the top. And you should be able to tell us a little bit about where you're joining us from.
We're going to have 4 questions for you here. They'll all be quick ones, but let us know. So it looks like a real mix there. We've got the United States, Germany, India, London, Pune, Hong Kong, moving past Brazil. Okay, so a good mix. So what industry or discipline do you work in? Looks like public health is the biggest one, but planning and design very close behind. And quite a lot of people in climate service as well. And other. What personal actions do you take to stay safe in the heat? This is you yourself. Yep, a lot of drinking water, hydrating, staying in the shade. Air conditioning is pretty high up there. Not seeing too many use of green spaces yet, though maybe stay in shade. Stay indoors. Okay. Interesting.
All right. Larry, do you want me to move on to the next one?
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so this one is actions that your community is taking to mitigate heat, not just you in your own life, but what you're seeing happening around you. Cooling centers, tree planting, white roofs on buildings. Nothing much. That's useful. Green infrastructure. Yeah. Nothing and nothing much are pretty big in there. Okay, we'll have plenty to talk about today then. Okay, great. Thanks for running that. So first, we'd like to hear from Regina. Regina, you've got 10 minutes. Is your mic on? Thanks.
Now.
Please go ahead.
Great. If you want to grant me the access to share. Thank you. Great. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thanks very much. Thanks also for the GHIN Network for having me today on this panel. And hello to everyone. So my name is Regina Fetta. I'm working for C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group, where I'm managing the Cool Cities Network. And I'm going to give a quick kind of global overview of how cities around the world are managing heat risk. I'm going to show that with lots of examples from cities that we're working with. So I'll give a bit of a context to the organization I'm working for, C40. We'll talk a little bit about heat vulnerability and how cities are mapping heat and heat vulnerability, and then different actions cities are taking. And if we do have time at the end, talk a bit about integrating climate mitigation and adaptation actions. So in terms of C40 is an organization that connects 96 cities worldwide to tackle the climate crisis together. And the organization was really built on the idea that cities and local governments are crucial when it comes to innovative ideas and tackling difficult policies and making a real change. So these 96 cities represent over 650 million people and 25% of the world economy. So they really can make a difference if they're acting together. And well, I think as Joy has mentioned at the beginning as well, cities are really engines of growth and innovations. More than half of our world population lives in cities, but at the same time, cities are also huge carbon emitters and are very vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So cities represent about 70% of our global emissions, and also 98% of the cities that we're working with are already experiencing the impacts of climate change on a yearly basis. So here are some examples, and we hear this from all of our cities around the world, that more and more climate impacts they're facing every year, from flooding and landslides to heat waves to water shortages. And these are just 3 examples from last year. But we're hearing this every year from all our member cities, how climate change is a real thing for them already, and are really working to adapt to the changes. And what's maybe the most powerful thing about C40 is it's led by the cities and by the mayors of the cities. So this is an image of kind of our steering committee, which is really a group of mayors from around the world who are really driving the agenda and the focus of what we're working on, what our topics are. So we're working on a very high level, kind of political level, but at the same time, we have 16 technical networks where we're working with those city governments and the specific departments on various topics around energy and building, transportation, food waste and water, air quality. And also in terms of adaptation, we have 3 networks, one working on kind of coastal issues around sea level rise and storms, one around urban flooding, and the Cool Cities Network, obviously around urban heat. And how this network works is really that it helps cities to replicate, improve, and accelerate climate actions. So we see it in our work that cities can learn so much from each other, from the best practices, but also from the difficulties and maybe from the failures. So the idea is really that not every city has to reinvent the wheel new, but they can really learn from each other and sharing information, experiences, challenges, and help each other through different stages of policy development. And we're getting the feedback as well from our cities that through kind of participating in networks, they are really improving and implementing new climate action. The Cool Cities Network that I'm managing is a mix of 35 cities, more or less, globally. And you can see here really represented across the world. And what's really interesting to see here is that although the political context or the climate reality might be very different across these cities, the issues that they're working with or the solutions are very similar. So challenges around financing, around maintenance of green infrastructure, and so on are quite similar. And it's really inspiring to see how cities can learn so much from each other. But also what we've seen over the last years, just like this number of cities has grown so much over the past 2-3 years of like every month, every couple of months, a new city wanting to join the network because heat really is becoming such a more prominent issue all around the world. So what I'm going to do now is just go a bit more into the topic side of what we're working on with the cities around heat. And I have a few slides, for example, on heat risk mapping. So that's really a first step that many cities are taking to get an idea of the situation in their cities, to have the data about where is the heat risk in the city, where are people most vulnerable. So you see here some maps from Athens, from Seoul, from Madrid, from New York, all coming in slightly different forms and shapes, but the idea is really for cities to understand their heat risk and then to act in those areas that are most at risk. And I'm coming with a couple of examples from cities now. For example, for surface temperature maps, here's an example of Paris's surface temperature map, where cities are measuring the kind of energy giving off by the urban fabric, by buildings, by roads, by what's happening in the city, and they're measuring that through satellite or instruments that are mounted to satellites or airplanes. And but these heat maps are really just a snapshot in time, and the urban microclimates are very dynamic, actually. So it doesn't give the whole story. So in addition to that, many cities are also now developing a kind of network of air temperature sensors across the cities, and these are more on a local level measuring the air temperature. And these can either be kind of fixed meteorological sensors, but also we're more and more seeing also mobile sensors, a really interesting project around citizen science of having sensors on backpacks and cyclists and so on, to really get an idea of the urban microclimate on different days of the year, on different times of the day. And to use this data, and here's an example from Madrid where they installed 27 sensors that are giving kind of real-time data, to use this data to really find out how the urban heat island is developing in the city in different times of the day. And also to mention here that it's not just the temperature data that's important, but many cities as well overlaying that with social demographic data to establish heat vulnerability indexes, because heat is a complete unjust topic as well, because many of the areas in cities are heat vulnerable because of lack of green spaces, because of poor housing, because of racial unjust housing policies. And all of this is being mapped as well in many cases by cities through these heat vulnerability indexes to really find out where not only the temperature, but also the vulnerability of the people living in these areas is highest. And then with the idea, obviously, to tackle and to implement cooling solutions specifically in those areas. And I'm now going to talk a bit about the solution side. So in our work in the network, we're really distinguishing between the heat emergency management side and then what are long-term cooling actions that cities are taking. And in terms of heat wave emergency management, cities developing heat wave protocols where they have different responses of kind of triggering of when a specific temperature arises, of what kind of emergency management needs to be in place, developing communication campaigns. So these are strategies for reaching most vulnerable populations, and also developing networks of cooling centers, which can be public or private spaces within a city where, in a heat wave, they're activated for citizens they can go to and seek kind of temporary heat relief. And an example for a communications campaign, for example, is the city of Buenos Aires, where you can see here a flyer that they've done, and they're distributing in a heat wave that's talking about kind of what are the risks and what citizens should be doing. But at the same time, they've organized these workshops where they reached over 3,000 elderly people to talk about heat risks and what to do to stay cool in a heat wave. They've also launched a kind of mass communication campaign where they're sending out, excuse me, I think around the number somewhere 200,000 phone calls or WhatsApp messages and text messages and so on in a heat wave event to alert their citizens. So really, the idea of communications campaign is to choose the different modes of communication accordingly to what kind of vulnerable groups a city wants to reach. And then, in terms of long-term cooling actions, there are really four main buckets that we're looking at with the cities in our network. And again, many of these things are very obvious to you, but I'm just going to mention them anyway and have some city examples. Reducing surface temperature is obviously having lighter surfaces in the city or more permeable surfaces in the city that reflect away more of the light and absorb less heat, and that's then making the surrounding environment less hot. And here's an example of Tokyo, for example, where they installed about 126 kilometers of heel shielding pavement, actually in the run-up to the Olympics. Now those have been postponed, but they're continuing with the project. And you can see really the temperature difference between the lighter pavement and the darker pavement. And similar things are happening in cities around cool roofs, where they're introducing either incentives or also regulations around lighter surfaces of roofs. And then one of the key go-to solution, obviously, is bringing nature back into the city because of all the many co-benefits that are out there, from improved air quality to biodiversity, mental and physical health. So this is really many of the reasons, and obviously heat and flood protection in terms of climate change, where cities are going to introduce more nature. But that being said, cities are also becoming more aware of how unequally distributed nature in city often is, like some areas being very green where others are not very green. So I think a lot of thinking is also shifting right now of making sure that nature is accessible for everyone in a city. And again, some examples with green roofs and green walls. They have come in different shapes and forms and have different purposes as well. If the layer is thicker on a green roof, or if it's thinner, if it can be used for recreation as well, or just for kind of biodiversity or cooling effects. Singapore, for example, has a policy that's called Lush policy that's regulating and incentivizing private building greenery. Durban in South Africa has a green roof guidance that's kind of giving support to green roofs on residential buildings and really encouraging private building owners to install green roofs. Urban forests, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but obviously trees are amazing, and more trees make more, also creating a cooler atmosphere in the city. So here are some examples of cities, Seoul or Athens, but I think I want to just quickly explain the Medellin one because I think it's very inspiring. They have installed around 9 green corridors in their city that's kind of connecting different green spaces, and with the aim of obviously reducing the urban heat island effect, also improving biodiversity, air quality, but also creating kind of active mobility spaces where people can walk and cycle. And they've really focused their green corridors on marginalized and kind of low-income neighborhoods with the idea to give people a more sense of place, and also with the aim of reducing crime in those areas, and as well of job creation, because it's the local residents who are being trained by the botanical gardens to take care of these new green spaces. So I think that's also an interesting example in terms of increasing greenery.
Regina, we've hit 10 minutes. Can you wrap up as quickly as you can?
Yeah, so shading, just to mention, obviously is a bit more flexible than planting a tree, and cities like Tel Aviv having innovative shading competitions or shading guidelines to put up shading structures in the city on public spaces or on sidewalks. And also, last but not least, using water features either kind of large water bodies or fountains, sprinklers. And here, this example from Cape Town are these water spray parks, which especially in cities that are also have problems of drought, because they're using less water than pools. So I think I'm going to stop here. I'm going to skip the integration heat into other sectors, but maybe that's something we can pull up within the discussion bit. And just to mention that we have loads of materials on kind of C40's Knowledge Hub for you to read about interdependencies, the future we don't want, in these integration guides. And that's it. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much. Yeah, well, definitely, we've got time for questions later. And if you'll notice, if you go to the Mentimeter page, there's a spot in there to put your questions in. As you think of them, listening to our panelists, please go to the Mentimeter for a moment, stick your question in there, and you should be able to vote those up and down so the most popular questions can be answered. Next up, we have Jeffrey Raven. Jeffrey?
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So thank you so much for inviting me to this terrific panel and around this topic that's absolutely urgent. I'm, as you heard from the intro, I'm an architect. And so I come out of a practice background, but I also teach at university. And I'm very interested in the intersection of climate science and climate action through policy mechanisms as well as design prototyping. So I'm going to show you some examples in a minute, but first I want to get into some basic principles and some questions of some challenges that we are facing. So to start with, the research is clear on how cities are grappling with heat. And we are essentially now in a phase where we have to apply the research as quickly as possible. This is a very interesting document, Climate Change in Cities. For the first time, this climate science publication included a chapter on urban planning and urban design, which I was the coordinating lead author for. And I think this scholarship provides a blueprint of how to configure these sustainable and climate resilient urban districts. So I think that this is a sort of good jumping off point for discussing the kinds of challenges and the solutions. So speaking of challenges and solutions, we know that compact settlements reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We know that from Planning 101. Compact urban form contributes to the reduction of carbon emissions. Low density areas, by contrast, contribute disproportionately to climate change, kind of suburban sprawl. And we know that urbanization amplifies climate change impacts. So there we have a quandary. There's also a concentration of people, public-private assets in these dense urban environments as well. So that's it's a situation that we have to address. The city is basically our challenge and our solution at the same time. So the question might be, oftentimes, and especially during COVID, we are hearing about, well, why don't we just empty out cities and live in a kind of smaller, lower density kinds of settlement patterns. And the challenge there is that as we see from these sort of scenarios that you see on your screen, that the low density settlement patterns on the right-hand side require a substantial amount of hard surfaces, such as roadways, highways, etc. So that ultimately, as we expand into a kind of regional, when we look at it kind of from a regional perspective, the low density settlement patterns are extremely problematic. And there's a sort of a question about adaptation and mitigation. So we could adapt to localized heat by going to lower density developments. But the flip side is the region will get hotter overall, and also the greenhouse gas emissions from that low density development patterns, those low density development patterns will be more problematic. So the game is really, how do we design high density urban districts that are at the same time pleasant places to live and also provide human comfort in a changing climate. And so this is not just the work of urban designers. Urban climatologists, as you can see on the left-hand side, have developed these kind of three-dimensional morphological scenarios for urban districts. And the question now is, how do urban designers work with these climate scientists and develop prototypes for success? So the prioritizing of adaptation and mitigation integrated together is really, I think, what is the most exciting sort of area of work that we could get involved with. For example, we did a project here that you'll see, and I'll talk about in a minute, in Brooklyn, New York, where we do scenario modeling for 2019 and 2050. We do future scenario modeling, and we show the relationship between urban heat island and carbon footprint of that urban district. So the kind of pillars of I think C40, is also really doing a great job in providing a kind of prototyping and kind of categories of strategies, is based on, in the research that we've done, 4 basic factors. Number 1 is efficiency of urban systems. Number 2 is the form and layout of the urban district. Number 3 is heat resistant construction materials, and 4 is vegetative cover. And number 1 is the only one that is really focusing on urban function. In other words, it's essentially how humans use the city, the kind of decisions they make, etc. Whereas form and layout, and the others are more about actual form, how cities have actually been built. So number 1 is really about pollution, from automobiles, from industry, that sort of thing. And the kind of work that we do at university and in the urban design field is we look at different sort of ways of designing 3-dimensional spaces so that we can maximize the benefits of urban ventilation, natural ventilation through the city, and also work with solar impacts as well. The design intervention process is very interesting, where we sort of develop a kind of climate analysis mapping, which was described in the previous presentation. And as was said, the surface heat is only a snapshot of the true dimension of the problem that cities face, because it's actually a fairly blunt instrument. But it provides a sort of way of zeroing in on urban districts that are particularly problematic. And number 2 is basically then you will go in and work with community, the communities in those districts. Those communities, we're essentially helping or aiding and assisting those communities in confronting these kinds of challenges. As was said, it gives more opportunities for community members to engage in the process, to become specialists on their own, to develop sensors, techniques that get a much more granular understanding of the situation, and then be part of the planning and design intervention, and eventually the post-intervention evaluation. So that's one of the things that I've been very excited to do, is to work with climate scientists, community members, and others to make climate science actionable. So here you have an image of a table. On the right-hand side are urban designers, architects, and landscape architects. On the right-hand side are climate scientists. And we're looking at ways of how we work and how we share terms, the kinds of terms that we use, so that we can bridge between the areas of expertise from both sides. And we've done a number of these climate, urban design climate workshops where we have worked with a group of climate scientists, urban designers, community members, and policymakers to develop scenarios for reducing the effect of urban heat in vulnerable communities. And we've done this, in Europe, in North Africa, and in Durban, South Africa, etc. So these have been really interesting, and we're going to continue to work on these in the future. We have a terrific team that we put together, and we are moving forward with this kind of work. And one of the techniques that we use...
coming up on 10 minutes here. Just
okay. Yeah, super. One of the techniques that we use is we actually take climate science off the table, and we work with the communities on the kinds of issues that they're facing: job creation challenges, access to services, public health, redlining, things of that nature. And ultimately, through the kind of understanding of the issues of the community, we actually are really keen to then figure out how those fit into these sort of 4 climate factors that are coming from the scientific side of the table. And the co-benefits are really quite interesting. There's a really kind of cross-fertilization that can happen between climate justice, climate science, and urban design. That is depicted here with these cards on a table, where we're looking at, for example, green infrastructure in the middle, and all around are different colored cards, including economic development cards, public health cards. So win-win opportunities exist. And so I'm just going to take you really quickly through this project that we worked on in Brooklyn, New York, where we looked at the climate mitigation and climate adaptation, and combined those two with a number of really extraordinary partners. The work that we did here is a kind of classic setup where we have the scenarios in the center of today versus 2050 business as usual and 2050 best practice, with the carbon footprint on the left and the urban heat island on the right, looking for win-win opportunities across climate adaptation and climate mitigation. And so I'll just take you through quickly some of these. These are layers of heat and flood, for example, how the sort of density plays into those through this modeling technique, how we prototype residential architecture in the area, and also manufacturing, where we have maximized passive ventilation and develop scenarios for the urban districts. And we get down into a granular urban design scale. And by the way, I think the urban district has been sort of the orphan in these kinds of discussions, because this represents really a great opportunity to a great scale to work with respect to urban heat island. And so we've got these surface temperature scenarios for future scenarios there. And then I'm going to close with this, where we just look at, all right. And these are just phasing scenarios for short-term, medium-term, and long-term phasing. And that's it. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. Sorry to cut you off.
No worries.
I just want to make sure we get to everybody. And
absolutely.
Questions, please. If you've got questions for Jeffrey, stick them in the Mentimeter. It's www.menti.com, and the number is 974111 if you're not already in. Calvin, tell us about what's happening in your part of the world.
Well, thank you very much. I'm actually dialing in from Hong Kong, so I'll share a little bit about what's what's going on in the real estate sector here. You guys have all heard already from Regina talking about the government perspective and the role governments play in this. You've heard from Jeffrey talking about urban planning and that role in terms of heat mitigation. I will spend a few minutes to give you some insight into how the real estate sector, specifically businesses, are addressing and managing heat associated with climate change and just heat in general. Just really quickly, I work for Link Real Estate Investment Trust. We manage a portfolio of about 131, 132 properties around the world, primarily retail. We're in mainland China, Hong Kong, Sydney, and we just got a place over in London as well. So all these locations have to deal with heat, and it is one of the key issues that we're looking at for our long-term strategy. So today I'll share how we approach heat on three aspects. The first is going to be design and construction. The second is going to be operations, how do we operate a building. And lastly, I'll touch a little bit on kind of the retail usage of a building and perhaps investment and how heat affects our decision-making on those investment processes. One more thing that I would like to highlight, as a real estate investment trust, we do take a different view from other developers in the sense that our objective is to build, manage, and hold these properties long term. So this does impact our decisions on which properties to invest in, how to build properties, and so forth. On the screen right now, you can actually see a rendering of the Quayside, our flagship office development in Hong Kong. We completed this about a year and a half ago. And it's actually quite an iconic building for the location, all being in Hong Kong. If you have been to Hong Kong, you'll notice that a lot of the buildings are actually essentially just squares, being built straight up. That maximizes the floor area and usage. One of the problems of having such high land prices in Hong Kong that you want to maximize the usable area. But you'll notice that this design, Quayside, maybe for other locations around the world, the design is not necessarily unique, but in Hong Kong, it actually is quite interesting, a kind of a curvilinear building design. And I'll talk a little bit about how this was specifically put together to factor in heat. So let me go to the next slide here. There we go. Background information. The building itself, some of the awards that we've received. Well, some of the awards that we've since received, and these certifications are actually one of the guidances that we've used to manage how heat is experienced throughout our building, and I'll touch on those in just a couple of slides. Firstly, this is similar to one of the slides that Jeffrey just showed. Really a profile view of our building on the right-hand side, and kind of the external factors that our building deals with on the left-hand side. Heat coming from the freeway that's located nearby, the solar heat, excessive solar heat as well. And this really just gives a profile into how we are using some trees to help manage, or greenscaping to help manage heat loading. You can see the transition of using trees to block direct sunlight, setting the building back just a little bit to manage direct sunlight coming in. As you can see from the bottom, we really have a canopy to kind of filter air pollution, noise, and glare from some of the pollution that is near our building. As you've heard from the previous presentations, there's a lot of data that's available on city levels regarding solar insolation, solar irradiation, and we factor a lot of this into our building design. You can see on this slide here, kind of different assessments that we've completed. The solar, daylight, and wind environment to understand how our building might impact the wind flow in the area, how our building might be impacted by solar, and so forth. I mean, the key was that instead of just designing a building, we wanted to make sure that we are part of the community that the building will be in, and to set example for how buildings should be done in Hong Kong. This is just a slide to show you the analysis that we've done for solar irradiation, really looking at specifically what time of the day we'll have, kind of the sun shining directly, which specific areas, where we project certain temperatures to be. So on the lower left-hand side, you can see, obviously the area shaded in red will be kind of the high heat areas. So from that perspective, we had to consider, okay, how do we mitigate and how we adapt to that, to the solar heat gain on those areas? How do we do it through building design? You'll see on the upper right-hand side, where you see the diagram that says Zone 1, Zone 2, Zone 3. These are actually fins that we installed around the building that were designed really to block direct sunlight going towards the windows so that we can minimize the heat loading. And all of this was factored into the building. The fins are different sizes depending on which areas were projected to have sunlight. So the areas that were marked in red have the wider fins, and the ones that are kind of shaded yellow have the shorter fins, and even the areas that actually projected to have very little heat gain, we actually have no fins on there. This is just a quick kind of rendering. You can see the fins that I was talking about, how it's not uniform across the entire facade, but built according to what our models suggested or indicated the heat loading would be. From a building management perspective, I think this is certainly a cost savings initiative. Obviously you use fewer materials when you don't have to cover the entire building with these fins. The other thing, as this slide indicates, is that we were certain on choosing materials that can help us minimize the heat loading. As I mentioned before, we are a real estate investment trust, so we want to manage all these buildings long term. So when we look at from a management perspective, any effort that we do to minimize the heat gain means that the long-term operation, we probably use less air conditioning and save on energy costs. So these are things that are factored into the entire design process for us. It's not just about the heat loading on the outside. So we were sure to also look at the heat loading inside as well. And this really gives you just a visual of kind of the thermal comfort assessment that we did for the property to make sure that the indoor environment is going to be suitable for any of the occupants. So we're fortunate that we actually occupy 2 of these floors, but we lease out the remaining 19 floors to other tenants. And part of this whole process is ensuring that the building itself was designed to maximize the thermal comfort. And we found out that this has actually been one of the key selling points or key incentives drawing some of our tenants into the building. Again, using that same concept that if we can minimize the thermal loading in the office space, then the tenants themselves will use less energy as well. The design of the building also took into account, how do we maximize natural lighting while reducing direct sunlight? And you can see from this diagram here how the fins that we installed were designed to reflect light onto slanted ceilings, which would then reflect the natural lighting coming back into the location. And then through a system of using blinds as well, we have an integrated system that actually prevents that solar heat gain and also interior glare as well. I can talk a little bit more about how this is one of the useful components that we use for rental assessments with prospective tenants. I'll touch on that shortly.
You've got about another minute, Calvin.
Wow, 10 minutes goes by really quickly. All right, so I'll touch a little bit on the operations, and one of the things that we do factor in is choosing the right equipment at the very beginning. We don't choose equipment that's going to be suitable just for that one, for the next 1 to 2 years. As I've mentioned, we hold properties long term, so we do make sure that the air conditioning systems will be are suitable for meeting future demands over the next 5 to 10 years or even beyond that. We know that as heat increases, as the number of hot days increases. We know that more people come into our properties, and in that perspective, we operate the air conditionings more often. And that ends up being kind of a paradox, because in the end, the more air conditioning we use, we actually create more heat as well. So managing kind of the thermal loading is one of the key ways to manage energy savings for our properties. Lastly, I said I want to touch a little bit on the rental use and so forth. I've mentioned that when we are able to demonstrate how this particular property will perform from a heat perspective, we can market this property to prospective tenants on a basis of energy savings for their perspective, and more importantly, from a health and wellness standpoint for employees as well. Simply because tenants know that they would be able to work in a building that actually has better environments for their employees, and that has shown to be a kind of a key selling point for our tenants so far. Other than that, I think I'll leave my discussion to kind of the Q&A and go from there. Thanks.
Thanks, Calvin. I appreciate it. If you've got any questions for Calvin or anybody else you've heard from so far, please go to the Mentimeter and to that site and add them in. We'll be getting to them right after our next speaker, who is Kizzy from New York City, who will tell us a little bit about what's going on there with cool neighborhoods. Kizzy?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for having me, and it's great to see everybody and to hear your points. My name is Kizzy Charles Guzman, and I am a deputy at the Mayor's Office of Resiliency. Trying to advance my slides. While hurricanes are probably the thing that you think of in New York when we think about climate adaptation, actually storms are not the only climate hazard we are preparing for as city government. The New York City Panel on Climate Change is projecting that the number of days over 90 degrees will triple by the 2050s, and that New York City summers will be like Birmingham, Alabama. And we care about heat because heat exposure is deadly. As you've heard, is actually the leading cause of death when it comes to natural disasters. But it's also preventable, and that is why I do the work that I do. Indoor temperatures can be up to 20 degrees higher than outdoor temperatures without air conditioner. And in New York City, the heat mortality rates are associated with poverty and poor housing quality. So residential air conditioner prevalence in New York City is also unequally distributed, and that is a function of poverty and access. On average, every summer, as a result, we have about 450 heat-related emergency room visits, about 150 heat-related hospital admissions, about 13 heat stroke deaths, and about 115 excess deaths from heat-related causes. And so that means that people had underlying health conditions that were exacerbated by heat, and the person passed away from that. So here's a map of New York City. It shows us, this is our heat vulnerability index, which was developed in a partnership between the health department in New York and Columbia University researchers. This is at the census tract level. These are our 5 boroughs. So what you can see here is that our heat risk varies by neighborhood. So the areas in red are areas that have higher heat vulnerability versus areas in yellow, which have lower heat vulnerability. And our index is basically summarizing both environmental and social indicators that also have to do with poverty and race, which is interesting for us. What is notable about this map is that over 2 million New Yorkers in these red areas lack air conditioning, which we have come to see as a necessity as opposed to a luxury. So in 2017, we launched the Cool Neighborhood Strategy, which comprises these components down here on the right of your screen, which we won't have time to get into completely, but we'll do our best. Essentially, it's a series of initiatives that are targeted in those red areas of New York, right? We're trying to level the playing field. We're trying to address heat vulnerability for the populations that are most at risk. And so that includes everything from monitoring temperature to climate risk training for trusted messengers like home health aides and reporters, health and weather reporters, but also has to do with legislation. So we have required white and green roofs. We are targeting implementation of roofs, of full roofs in certain neighborhoods. We're investing in tree planting and so on. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Oh my God. Okay, so the core of the Cool Neighborhood strategy is a $100 million investment, mostly in street tree planting in key neighborhoods. And what you can see here is that our street trees, look at the picture on the top. Just within a 5-year period, you can see that a street that did not have any trees on it and that was very hot, it looks hot, it's perceived as hot, just within a 5-year period can become a shadier corridor for people. So what that means is that folks that are exposed to high heat temperatures indoors can actually look at the streetscape as a potential area to leave and to be able to make it to a cooling center without thinking of themselves as being even more exposed outdoors. Here's another example of our strategy within Cool Neighborhoods NYC, which is about implementing our already existing Cool Roofs program, but strategically in those areas in red. So here's the same map that I showed you earlier, but this time at the community district level. And what you can see is that we're trying to create clusters of light-colored surfaces. So those clusters are our roofs, and we are really trying to concentrate our deployment of these roofs in the neighborhoods that need it the most to try to achieve some level of neighborhood cooling. I will also note that for the Cool Roofs program, we are really targeting public housing. For example, you see here on the left is Albany houses in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, before and then after the coating of the roofs took place. We're offering these coatings at no cost to organizations and buildings that serve a social purpose, like senior centers and affordable housing, community organizations, shelters. And that is a way that we're trying to make sure that our social infrastructure not only achieves the benefits of cool roofs in terms of energy demand and energy cost savings, but also that they are resources to the community as opposed to being sources of heat pollution for the community. So at the end, though, most victims of heat-related deaths are actually exposed indoors in the city. And we have done studies and surveys for this and have realized that when it comes to New Yorkers, cost is a barrier to air conditioner ownership and use. Over a little under half of people who own an AC still don't use it because they're worried about paying that energy bill. And many use fans, which have been proven to not be safe. In fact, when we look at decedents from 2008 to 2011, 17% of them had a fan in the home, but none of them had a working air conditioner. And so what happens is that over 50% of the people that we've surveyed, even when they are considered vulnerable, they prefer to stay home even when it's unsafe for them to do so, even when they cannot stay cool in there. And part of it is a lack of awareness of risk, but also things like mobility impairments, right? We have also realized that our health and weather reporters and our media messages emphasize outdoor risk disproportionately. We have a heat wave and you see images of people jogging outdoors, you see workers outside, when actually most people who die from heat exposure are exposed indoors, and we don't have enough images of that, seniors in their apartments. And so people don't see themselves reflected on TV and don't perceive the risk to be there when it is. So here's an updated version of the same index, but using updated information. And so what we also did was add a fifth indicator to this index, which is air conditioning prevalence. And so I just want to close out with a quick anecdote on this, which is that this is our updated map that we've been working with on Cool Neighborhoods. But at the end of March, when we were really, really in the tank for COVID-19 infections, this was the map of patients, the percent of patients testing positive for COVID-19. And so this was end of March. Again, our infection rate was high. The areas in red are areas that had up to 73% of infections coming back positive. And to me, this map, when I looked at it, it reminded me of this map. So I'll do it again. And so what happened was that at this point, we start sounding the alarm that it is winter time and we're in the midst of the global pandemic, but we need to start planning for the summer months, because what I saw was a collision course between this climate risk and this public health risk. And so at the end, we were able to, after a lot of work, able to announce on May 15th, 2 initiatives that I think are saving lives. One is actually distributing cooling systems for low-income seniors. We want to prevent death, and heat mortality is always preventable. And secondly, we wanted to address that gap from people that have air conditioning at home but are worried about the electricity bills. And so adding some utility bill assistance by petitioning the state to allow low-income New Yorkers to have a bit of a break would allow us to then not have to choose between putting food on the table and staying cool in the summer, especially at a time when we were asking everyone to stay indoors and to social distance, and a time when we knew that we weren't going to have open pools and open beaches, and at a time when we knew that even our cooling centers, which were significantly distributed across the city, were mostly going to be closed, and those that were open were going to have to really decrease the amount of capacity in order to allow for the social distancing measures that we needed to put in place. So my overall message to you guys is that at the end, inequality is a big piece of this. Inequality exacerbates climate and environmental risks, which in turn has a tremendous effect on public health and the economy. And the built environment and planning decisions impact health and also contribute and perpetuate to economic inequality. And so I'm glad to see my other panelists think about the ways that the built environment can support equality, but also can support environmental health. I will take a page from government and say that, frankly, policy and investment decisions can also intentionally or inadvertently contribute to health disparities and environmental injustices and racial inequalities. And so we need more plans that are data-driven and that are meant to level the playing field. So I will posit that everyone has a role to play in this leveling of the playing field and addressing systemic issues, especially racism and segregation. Our communities are simply not on the same level, and they require targeted and different interventions in order to be able to stay safe, especially with a changing climate. So the last thought I'll leave with you is that multiple disciplines and obviously a public health perspective are needed to devise climate smart solutions that are more just. I often hear about the sustainability challenges of using air conditioning, but I do not believe, and in the city of New York, we do not believe that we should meet our sustainability goals on the backs of our most vulnerable people. And so again, incorporating a public health perspective and ensuring that what we're doing is protecting lives is a key perspective and it's a key tenet of the sustainability strategy that we think is needed on a global level. Thank you.
Thanks, Kizzy. I think that's, it is a really interesting thing to keep in mind that at the end, this is about protecting lives, right? You know, all of this leads to that, and useful to get that at the basis of the discussion. We're going to move to questions in just a minute, so please do put them in there if you haven't already. We've got quite a number in there, and we'll get to them in a minute. I just wanted to run through a few things that I thought were really interesting in this, points that were brought up. This issue that Kizzy just mentioned, that it's indoors, you know, as well as outdoors, that this risk is, you know, we spend a lot of time talking about these, making things cooler outside, but we should be recognizing as well that making it cooler in people's homes as opposed to in public places, particularly for people who can't get out, is probably worth thinking about in this. I thought it was really interesting in as well, Kevin, talking about the what a big incentive it is to have buildings that people like to work in and are comfortable living in as a selling point for your product. You know, what a difference it makes when you work in a building that's really nice and that temperatures are comfortable and it feels beautiful and functional. It's really interesting. We talked as well, several people, about the moving air through cities, that design has to really keep these channels open, you know, putting trees in the right spot or making sure that there's nothing blocking the flow of air is really important. Mm-hmm. And focusing on issues that communities want solved, not going in to talk to communities about heat first, but really listening to them about what their problems are and then figuring out ways that some of this work can be done around that. It's got to make it somewhat easier. Getting a common language between different kinds of groups, as Jeffrey was talking about, with planners, climate scientists, community people, that if you're all speaking different languages with different goals, it's very hard to bring it together into something that works overall. And this question as well that Regina brought up about this emergency management versus long-term work. You know, I think in cities that are just beginning to realize some of these threats, it may be hard to think about spending money on long-term issues, and it's more a question of responding to events as they happen. But that getting that balance right has to be a very interesting thing at a time when financing is short. So I'm going to move over here and take a look at these questions, and it looks to me like the most popular one so far is, how can cities in arid and semi-arid environments reduce their urban heat when water is a scarce resource and urban forestry may not be a silver bullet? That sounds like it might be one for Regina or for Jeffrey. Would either of you like that, or any of you?
I mean, I think in terms of urban design and building design solutions, I'm happy to give the floor to Jeffrey and Calvin. I think from the cities that we're working with, the cities like Dubai or Cape Town, I mentioned in terms of water scarcity and so on, what we're seeing is definitely these cities facing a challenge in terms of planting loads of trees and maintaining this green infrastructure and so on. But I think there's a lot of happening as well right now in terms of what types of species are well adapted in what types of climates, and that can still create shading and so on. So I think there are definitely also great infrastructure solutions, but then I think what I was mentioning as well in terms of other shading, it doesn't need to be green, it can also be with textiles and structures and so on. And there are some interesting examples, for example, as well in Singapore, where they've covered walkways to mass transit stations for people to still use mass transit in hot days, but having those covered walkways connected to hospitals and to kind of schools and so on, so people can still in hot times, or also when there's torrential rain, for example, still walk and be outside in a shaded way. Obviously, Singapore has not a problem with lush greenery.
I would like to add to that. That's a great question. We can look to our ancestors for some clues how in those climates they approached design and planning. And if you think about thermal mass, for example, within the building, so that the building can retain heat in its facade, so it doesn't necessarily focus on lightweight construction, but thermal mass that comes directly from the use of thick walls in some of those areas. There's also self-shading, in addition to what Regina was talking about, with the interesting project in Tel Aviv. There's also self-shading where buildings can self-shade, so you perhaps have narrower walking areas where it's cooler. And, choice, as Regina was saying, the choice of the trees is really important. I mean, palm trees are not particularly always native to an area, but are more decorative, and they don't provide as much canopy coverage as other tree species. So, also being very strategic in the approach. Finally, one last thing is looking again to our ancestors in those regions for the use of wind. Wind towers have been used over the centuries along the Persian Gulf area, Arabian Gulf area, and there's really some interesting projects. There's one in Masdar in Abu Dhabi, for example, that I was involved with this project, and using a kind of 21st century wind tower to cool the urban district. And you could imagine a series of wind towers that also could be useful in New York City, and to capture prevailing winds and bring it down to the street level as well. So there's a lot there that I think is really exciting, and that really the focus should be on those kinds of solutions.
Thanks. Did either of you want, Calvin or Kizzy, want to comment on that, or shall I move on to the next one?
I think Regina covered all of that.
So the next question is, many urban areas are not high investment zones with fancy architecture and buildings. What cooling options can slum areas and old neighborhoods be considering? That might be a good one for you to start with, Kizzy.
Well, so I would posit that we should not come at this from a perspective of having two different set of solutions that are based on how much money a neighborhood has to pay for those solutions. That is in itself part of the problematic piece. So even in places like New York City, when we tend to think about investing in high income, high value neighborhoods in a different way versus in neighborhoods that have been more historically disenfranchised, more historically disinvested in, I'm saying that that is precisely the problem. And so what governments should be doing is actually prioritizing public health and prioritizing equity and incentivizing the right type of development that has these principles at their core, right? Putting our tax dollars to work in the benefit of those neighborhoods that are quote unquote the slums and the old neighborhoods, right? And not everything can be new construction. And not everywhere can be, not every innovation can only be applied to brand new construction and brand new buildings and beautiful design that is really focused on aesthetics. At the end, we need to find where it is that people live, and we need to be able to level that playing field by putting public investment in those areas. Otherwise, people will perish from the climate crisis if you're making those choices that are actually inherently economically racist.
Thanks. Calvin, Regina, Jeffrey, any of you have a comment on that?
I could throw, oh, go ahead, Calvin, go ahead.
So I think one way Hong Kong kind of deals with this is that we actually manage, very tightly how much, land can be developed and what type of land can be developed. We actually hold, I think, upwards of 75% of our land as natural parks and so forth, leaving very little land for us to really develop. And what that means is that, in Hong Kong, we actually go through essentially revitalizing different parts of the city, essentially on a rolling basis. So, what might be a slum area now typically gets revitalized because of the, we don't make a lot of, the government doesn't make a lot of land available. So we do go through a process of revitalizing one neighborhood, and then that becomes kind of a key area, and then the next area gets revitalized. So it's kind of a cyclical process. During that stage, a lot of things that we are starting to look at is really some of the things that have already been mentioned, more street, building more underground, walkways and connectivity that way. So to take people away from direct sunlight and have them get to their locations easily. In order to get this done, it really is, as kind of what Kizzy said, it's really a mass kind of urban planning project where certain policies have to be put in place by government, and then you have developers that are aligned with that thinking and collaborating on that approach as well. At least that's how we're doing it here in Hong Kong.
Thanks, Calvin. Jeffrey, did you have something to say on that?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest, just building on what Kizzy was saying, one of the biggest issues in informal settlements and also vulnerable areas in the United States, but informal settlements overseas also, is the location of toxic emissions facilities. And those tend to be, obviously targeted, that we've seen targeted to those kinds of neighborhoods. And it's a toxic brew because you combine that with urban heat, and that causes a huge issue with respect to the health of vulnerable members of the community. So I think part of it is also the locating of these polluting facilities away from those zones and equitably distributed throughout the city. the second thing, so the pollution, the emissions is a big issue in those zones, and as Kizzy points out, you know, the double whammy of COVID and urban heat, and also, you know, airborne particles tend to be located in those same zones with high asthma rates and all the public health issues. But just, you know, some simple techniques I showed, sort of short-term, medium term, and long-term at the end of my presentation. You know, some short-term are, you know, reflective surfaces. For example, in some of the favelas in Brazil, for example, they really were focusing on high reflectivity roofs as ways to cool down the zone. You know, some of their informal settlements, and you know, techniques like that. You know, maximizing perhaps some sort of linear passage that's aligned with the prevailing winds would also help cool down. But there's a whole myriad of techniques that you can use.
Okay. Next one I can see. How are cities financing cooling interventions? Are there good practices or funding sources that cities are accessing? Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Or is there no money out there?
Sorry, Laurie, the question was, the question on the screen is different from what you just answered.
Oh, sorry, okay. Let me show you that one. If indoor temperatures are such a problem, how can we have better sensors for dangerous indoor temperatures to alert people? Are there building regulations for safe indoor temperatures? Do they exist?
So I guess I can give a little bit of insight. So the building that I showed you, the quayside, one of the certification processes that we went through was well certification. So that comes from the U.S. And one of the areas on there talks about thermal loading, and there are set kind of best practices for how thermal heat should be in the building. And as part of that, there's actually not a lot of well, I guess in my opinion, there's not a lot of expensive sensors that you would need. In a way, it's a temperature gauge that can be connected to a building management system, and those are relatively cheap. You can put them up onto different locations, and you can follow the well standard on where you place those temperature gauges, and that's one of the ways that we deal with that here. The other thing ends up being that, with government, that's also going to be a key way to encourage indoor temperatures. In Hong Kong, we do have an initiative to try to keep temperatures indoors to be about 26 degrees Celsius. And I can't do the Celsius to Fahrenheit conversion in my head right now, but that has been one way that we do manage the kind of temperature indoors as well.
Okay.
I want just to add that yes, there are certain building codes that are far more advanced that do require a certain indoor temperatures to be maintained in critical facilities like nursing homes or adult care facilities that in the United States can be up to 81 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a little higher than the 26 degrees Celsius that Calvin mentioned. But frankly, more needs to be done in that space, because that normally tends to do with buildings that have this buildings management system, or that have centralized air conditioner, where it's easier, right, to regulate indoor temperature that way, when really in residential units in particular, it's really hard to know, depending on the location of the apartment, how airflow and how temperature will differ, how high in the building you are versus how low, and all heat retention in a building can really vary greatly. So in New York City, we actually have the opposite. We have a temperature threshold for when it's too cold. And at that temperature, we say landlords are required to provide heat. And one of the things that we've discussed ad nauseum for the last few years is, why don't we have a maximum temperature threshold, a temperature past which a landlord is required to provide cooling, or at least one room within the building where a cooling respite can happen, right? And that has been very difficult to achieve, precisely because there isn't this very specific health-based standard. I'll just say one more thing in this question, which is that, again, because the temperature changes so much between one occupancy and another type of occupancy, what is happening is that we overcool our buildings, when in itself, right, that is a sustainability problem. We go to work in the summer months and all the women are wearing sweaters. And in my particular office, there are women that have portable heaters under their desk. So think about the energy inefficiency of a practice like that, that we overcool our buildings, right? Meanwhile, people are allowed to bake inside their apartments. And so there's a bit of that conundrum there, that at the end, even these indoor temperatures will treat someone very differently if that person has, is very healthy versus if that person has a compromised health system, right? And so we do need a health-based standard for indoor temperature, and I do hope that cities and public health practitioners writ large would work on that and kind of make those assessments on our behalf.
I wonder if there's technology there too. I remember talking to someone that worked on energy efficiency, and they said what you need to do is not cool the building, but cool the people. And they had worked out some clever system where on each person's desk chair, to solve exactly this problem you're talking about, of half the people being in sweaters and the others way too hot, they had put fans and seat heaters in each chair, and people turned them on as they felt they were needed, and they found that they actually dramatically reduced the amount of energy used in the building. It's an interesting idea. Next question. Kizzy, your point on media communicating outdoor heat risk, while most people who die of heat are indoors, is so interesting and important. How is New York City working with the media to address this question?
Okay, so as part of our Cool Neighborhood strategy, we have in the past held roundtables and invited our friends that are meteorologists or health and weather reporters writ large. Partly, we're looking for those trusted messengers. So New Yorkers, they listen to the weatherman, right? And they listen to their doctors, and when they're watching the news, they listen to the person that is reporting health-based news. So we did that targeting, and we created materials that we were able to share with them. And there is a lot more work to be done. I think at the end, part of what's really challenging is getting those images, getting what they call the B-roll. Every reporter wants to come out and be able to show it's a heat wave. This is what's happening. Go to the cooling centers, go to the beaches. And so what is easy to film is always going to be an outdoor scene. I think that getting access to people's apartments and showing those images is actually really hard. People don't want reporters inside their home taking photos or video of themselves as they are trying to stay cool with a fan, right? So I think that trying to make those connections has been really critical, trying to make sure that our press and reporter are actually emphasizing the need for people to check on each other. And are emphasizing that the word should be there is indoor risk. And so here are the things that you need to do. If you meet this criteria, if you have cardiovascular disease, or if you take certain medications, if you are over this age, you need to stay cool. You can go to the cooling centers. Here's where they are. So I think that just it's been a trying, but we have a multi-agency effort to communicate both through our trusted messengers that are the community organizations, but also through the media, trying to get those messages to people.
Okay, thanks. Next question is, how can smaller cities with less resources and limited access to universities become more heat resilient? Who'd like to take that one? Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think that again, the sort of phasing is relevant here, where there are. I mean, I think it's really important to break through these. I mean, we always talk about silo busting, but it's really important in this case where we need to confront these challenges, but it also offers economic development opportunities for cities of all sizes. So, for example, if we're retrofitting our buildings, that's going to make them more efficient, which will save energy and eventually money. It's going to also lower the health cases in a particular city. So that also then takes pressure off hospitals and that sort of thing. So that also is a win-win there as well. So the economics and the health are major drags on a particular city of all sizes, and I think these kinds of strategies are directly working in those spaces. And I think so that's really important to kind of shape the narrative so that it's understood that this is part of that process, as opposed to kind of a separate thing that just costs money to do. And again, I mentioned, in the short term, cool roofing provides good job opportunities for people just to kind of get involved in retrofitting buildings. Heat-resistant construction materials are going to have to be part of a retrofitting opportunity. So you could work with unions on those kinds of jobs around the retrofits. And then, of course, the sort of developing non-motorized bike and pedestrian opportunities within the city is part of the picture, because again, you're reducing the emissions, which when combined with urban heat, that's a big health risk, etc. So there's and then maximizing tree planting and vegetative cover. I mean, those all have great job opportunities related to them. But again, I think these happen at more of a district scale, or to a certain degree at a city scale, but certainly at a district scale. And I really want to tackle that here in this group, because I think that the district offers some great opportunities at that scale to tackle some of these problems, rather than being very sort of focused at the building, individual buildings. Buildings operate within a context, and the context that they operate within is a district. And so if we can cool the district down, we're also cooling the buildings down, and we're also offering opportunities for people to get out of their buildings, to enjoy cool microclimates within the area. So anyway, those are some ideas.
Thanks.
I can add something, kind of building on Jeffrey's answer, is that I agree. I think the solutions for smaller or bigger cities are actually the same. And I think in terms of resources, the same. I mean, also big cities have issues of finding resources for cooling actions. I mean, not many cities actually have a budget for climate adaptation or specifically for heat. So cities, any sites need to be very smart about how to finance any of this, or how to find opportunities to piggyback on other investments that are happening in the city to integrate any cooling measures. And I mean, examples there can be, if a city is anyway doing roadworks every 4 or 5 years, how to maybe change the layer of asphalt, maybe introducing cool pavement, or if cities are refurbishing their schools every couple of years, how to make sure schools in especially heat risk neighborhoods getting refurbished, or getting kind of heat adapted measures to it. Or same with tree planting, if a city is investing into trees, to make sure these trees that they are going to plant are in heat vulnerable areas. So I think kind of regardless of the size of the cities, to find kind of innovative way to actually realizing these cooling actions, I think is a challenge and opportunity for both small and big cities.
Thanks, Regina.
I want to echo what has been said, and those are great points. The solutions are the same, and I just want to add one more thing. Investing in climate adaptation is a decision. It's a decision the same way that we decide to invest in transportation or in police departments or in school districts. It's a decision, right? It's not one or the other. And I think that part of it is making sure that the city that you have, whether it is large or small, at the end is making a commitment to climate action, right? At the end is making a commitment to decrease in public health impacts and addressing, like the public health burden of environmental degradation and environmental pollution. So I think that in itself is how you achieve some of those financing options, because you're able to say, okay, we're going to use our building code, or we're going to use our zoning code in order to require the private sector to join us on this fact. in this fight, right? Like it is something that all of us, through our tax dollars, are meant to be investing in, and we're able to signal that value by through our elected officials and making those issues a priority, making environmental issues and their financing a priority. So I wanted to say that because it's really actually super important. Otherwise, cities will continue investing on the things that they think their residents want them to invest in. But actually, studies show that environmental issues, climate issues are at the front and center of the concern list for most Americans and globally, especially people of color. And so I would encourage, that synergy there between governments, regulatory approaches, but also residents and communities and what they want to see their communities thrive. Thanks.
The next question we've got is, how do cities know when they've been successful in mitigating heat? What metrics are useful? Is it a decrease in heat-related deaths, a decrease in surface temperatures? How do you know if you're doing well on this? Anybody
Again, I mean, it's a tricky one.
It's a tough question. Yeah, Regina, save us.
I mean, it's definitely a tricky one, and we're working right now with cities to develop climate action plans and kind of encouraging, obviously, heat risk cities to also have kind of robust strategy in place, and obviously having metrics there where you can really see how am I performing against the goals and targets I'm setting myself to become more resilient. How am I achieving those? And in climate adaptation, it's very difficult because risk is not like greenhouse gas emissions that you can measure and then you've achieved this or that. Risk is something way more difficult to measure. So I think there are definitely the metrics around planting trees and so on, but that's more on the action side and not on the what's the impact side. So I think a couple of cities do have temperature targets and measuring, actually figuring out how by planting these trees, doing a before and after analysis of the temperature reduction, and also seeing there what does that then relate to kind of hospital admissions and so on and so forth. So I think there are ways to do it, but it's definitely I think a tricky one. I don't know if New York has solved it.
No, we haven't. I think that's right. We have invested in temperature monitoring, both indoors and outdoors. What is hard is to get a sense of it over time, right? Like a temporal trend, right? The before and afters are actually really complicated because there are so many confounding factors that can make the city hotter at any given time because there are so many sources of waste heat. So, for example, just to give you a current one. Right now in New York, with people using less public transit, there's a lot more traffic. And so I can only imagine that all of the waste heat from the increased usage of cars, which is, unusual in New York, right? Because we were subway people. We were always subway people pre-COVID-19. That would have an impact on the readings that those monitors are capturing. But we have deployed a system of sensors trying to ascertain the contribution of our cool roofs and the contribution of our tree planting efforts. And we hope to publish that data in the coming years. But again, there are just so many confounding factors, including the fact that the climate is warming. So our baseline also keeps changing, right?
I have a question.
Yeah, Jeffrey, go ahead.
Building on what was said earlier, with Kizzy and Regina, I mean, there's a metric that's very helpful when you get down to the actual street level, and it's called the Universal Thermal Climate Index, UTCI, and it's really perceived temperature. So it involves not just temperature, which is actually a rather blunt metric, but also relative humidity, airspeed, elements like that that really are physiologically key to health, right? So, and the perception of comfort. So how people perceive their own comfort. So I think that's really important because then it brings into the picture all the other elements that we've talked about, which is, the importance of ventilation within the city, and also shading and et cetera. So, and I think that, we got to be careful using very blunt instruments like even the amount of vegetative cover in a city is actually a very blunt instrument because it doesn't get into tree canopy coverage necessarily. You could just have a lot of grass, and grass is, fairly useless with respect to, especially if it's poorly maintained, versus say tree canopy. So I think those are important factors.
Thanks very much. I think we've reached the end of our time for questions, sadly. We're supposed to be heading to the wrap-up, or do we have time for one more? Lad, what do you think?
Yeah, let's go ahead and wrap up just to respect everyone's time. Great. So
thanks.
Joy, I
really appreciate it. It's been absolutely fascinating, actually, to hear, and I wish we had a lot more time. But thank you. We really appreciate that, and all the great questions, and apologies for not getting to all of them. But hopefully you'll be able to get in touch one way or another with one of these networks or people with the network itself, and they can help provide some advice.
Great. Thank you so much, Lori, for moderating this discussion. And again, thank you to all of our panelists for joining us across the world in all of your different time zones. So to everyone still attending, please do look up our panelists and their work. They've done much more work than they could convey in just 2 hours. And they're all very inspirational in kind of extreme heat and what they've done. And so I especially really am encouraged by this discussion that we had today. I don't think for those of us like Lori, Extreme Health, and Regina that have been working in extreme heat for a while, a discussion like this wouldn't be something that you would have seen a couple of years ago. So I think just the fact that we were having this discussion together and the number of attendees that we have is a good positive thing that cities are recognizing the risks and getting more interested in actually addressing them. And I think particularly some of the questions just about the solutions that are pertinent to temperate areas may not be the ones that are the same solutions that work very well in arid and semi-arid environments. And so just really encouraged by the fact that we're kind of at the level of sophistication that we can talk about solutions depending on where you are in the world and the size of your city and the resources you have available. So I'd like to also thank all of the other people that are involved with putting webinars like this on from the GHIN Network. And so particularly to Hunter Jones at NOAA for helping kind of keeping this moving forward. Rup Singh, who is at Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center, who ran the Mentimeter today, but also has done some of our GHIN, and Maddie West, who is at the WHO WMO Joint Climate Office for help publicizing this event. And just again, for the attendees, this webinar recording and resources will be made available on the GHIN website. So you can share it or kind of reflect on it and look back in the future if you need to. And with that, I'll pass it back over to Joy, who has a few closing comments.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Lad, and thank you again to all of our presenters today, to Lori for moderating. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. I learned a ton. I hope everybody else did too. I just wanted to direct everyone's attention to a couple follow-ups that I hope everybody will stay engaged with, because we hope to expand our activities specifically related to cities. And so again, all of the resources that have been mentioned today by our presenters are going to be available on the website. And in our new website, there'll be a specific section for the community of practice working on urban heat issues. So do look for that in the coming month when we launch in August. We'll also be having these open forum calls starting in September. And we expect we're going to take forward some of the issues that were raised today so we can take a little bit more of a deep dive into those issues. There'll also be more activities and training available for urban specific issues. And so we're hoping to expand our current graduate, postdoc, and mid-career training opportunities in addition to the master classes. We'll also be engaging a little more with the WMO, Urban Integrated Climate Services team, on improving early warning systems at the urban scale. There's a number of heat island mapping projects, which we also expect to rise in prominence. So please do stay in touch. Stay tuned for new activities. We hope to see you all again. And if you've not already registered for the event tomorrow, Please do join us again for Heat in the Workplace. We're going to be taking a deep dive on this issue with speakers from the International Labor Organization, Andreas Flores from Greece, and from the German Red Cross to talk about some of their programming on the ground in Vietnam. So again, thanks to everyone, and we hope to see you tomorrow or in the future.